Hi guys, tonight we begin a calm journey into the life of Joan of Arc, the young girl who rose from a quiet village to lead armies and shape the destiny of France. She was a teenager who claimed to hear voices from heaven, a shepherdess who became a soldier, and a martyr whose story still stirs hearts 6 centuries later. In this series we will follow her path piece by piece, from her simple childhood to her final trial, unfolding not with noise, but with a quiet, steady rhythm. But before we begin, for those who enjoy slow, thoughtful stories about legendary figures, hit like, subscribe and share in the comments which personality or historical figure you'd like me to cover next. And tell me, where are you watching from? I'm always curious to see the different places my viewers are from. Joan was born in the small village of Domremy in northeastern France around the year 1412. During one of the most troubled times in French history, the 100 Years' War had raged for decades, leaving villages burned, families torn apart, and people unsure of what tomorrow might bring. England occupied large parts of northern France, while the French crown itself was weakened by political strife. To grow up in Domremy meant growing up surrounded by uncertainty, and yet for Joan, the rhythms of farm life and faith gave a sense of steadiness. Her parents were simple peasants, working the land as so many did. From her earliest years she was known as a pious child, often found in prayer when others were playing. Life in Domremy revolved around the seasons, planting in spring, harvest in summer, preparation for winter as the leaves fell. Children helped tend animals, collect firewood, and care for the small gardens that kept families alive. It was not a life of comfort, but one of resilience. Joan absorbed the world around her quietly, observing the fears of her people, but also their unshaken faith in God and their devotion to the saints. In this world of hardship, stories of miracles, visions, and divine protection were not unusual, and the church bells that rang over Domremy carried hope with every chime. By the time Joan reached her early teens, France was desperate for deliverance. The Dauphin, Charles, who hoped to be crowned king, was not yet secure on his throne, and the English, along with their Burgundian allies, pressed hard against his claim. Rumours drifted through villages like Domremy, stories of armies moving, of towns falling, of the crown's weakness. Yet for Joan, the certainty she began to feel was not rooted in rumour, but in what she believed to be the voice of God. She later described how, at around the age of 13, she began to hear voices, gentle, powerful presences that seemed to surround her with light. She identified them as Saint Michael the Archangel, St. Catherine and St. Margaret. These voices told her she had a mission, to drive out the English and to bring Charles to Reims, where he would be crowned as the rightful King of France. Imagine being a child, no more than 13, in a small farming village, suddenly carrying the conviction that you were chosen for something beyond comprehension. Joan did not speak of this to everyone at once. She kept her experiences close, turning them over in prayer, weighing them with a seriousness far beyond her years. At first she resisted, wondering how someone as humble as she could possibly be called to such a task, but the voices persisted, urging her with patience and strength. This secret became the compass of her young life, guiding her toward a destiny no one could have imagined for a peasant girl. The years between her first vision and her decision to act were years of growth, testing, and quiet preparation. She continued her life in Domremy, working, praying, caring for animals, and learning the ways of her village, yet always with an inner fire that no one else could see. The people around her likely noticed her unusual devotion, her serious gaze, her calm persistence, but they could not have guessed the scale of the path she would soon set upon. Slowly, gently, the world of Domremy was shaping a figure who would step into history, not with grandeur, but with the faith of a young girl who believed in her voices. As Joan grew into her teenage years, the voices did not fade. Instead, they became clearer, more insistent, and more demanding of her courage. For most of the young people in Domremy, life was destined to follow predictable lines: marriage, family, work in the fields, and loyalty to the local lord. But Joan felt that her future was not her own. The saints who spoke to her urged her again and again to act, to leave her village, and to take on a mission that no one would believe possible. For a time, she tried to silence these voices with prayer, hoping they would lessen. Yet they returned each time with renewed strength, filled with calm authority. The village itself lived under the shadow of war. Soldiers roamed nearby roads, raiding and burning villages. Stories of cruelty reached Domremy. Farmers dispossessed of their land, families fleeing, hunger spreading like a shadow. For Joan, the suffering of France was not distant news, but a wound she felt deeply, as though each loss was personal. Her devotion to her faith grew even stronger. She was known to attend church daily, spending long hours in prayer. Those who saw her might have thought she was simply pious, a girl devoted to her religion, but inside her heart the conviction was growing that she had been chosen to stand against the darkness pressing upon her country. By the time she was 16, the calling had become too strong to ignore. She began to speak to a small circle of trusted people about what she believed God wanted her to do. It was met at first with disbelief. How could a peasant girl lead armies? How could she change the fate of kings? But Joan's words carried a strange power. She spoke with quiet determination, not arrogance, and with a serenity that disarmed those who might have laughed. She described her visions in detail, naming the saints and recounting their instructions. Her listeners may not have understood fully, but many were moved by her conviction. She did not waver when questioned. She insisted that she must go to the Dauphin Charles, who was waiting in the town of Chinon, and tell him that God had sent her to help him reclaim his crown. The journey from Domremy to Chinon was long and dangerous, filled with soldiers, bandits, and uncertainty. For Joan to attempt it as a young woman was unthinkable, yet she was certain she would be protected. At last, after repeated refusals, she convinced the local lord Robert de Baudricourt of her sincerity. At first he dismissed her, but Joan's persistence wore him down. He saw in her something unusual, perhaps not yet believing in her visions, but unwilling to ignore the strength she carried. When he finally agreed to provide her with an escort, it was as though the first great door in her mission had opened. Joan prepared for her journey with both simplicity and gravity. She cut her hair short, donned men's clothing for safety, and gathered with her small band of escorts. With this transformation, she was stepping out of the life she had always known. Domremy faded into the distance behind her, its fields and church and quiet homes shrinking as she rode away. Before her stretched the uncertainty of a road filled with risk, and yet she carried no fear. Her voices had told her what to do, and she followed with the serenity of one who believes absolutely. The path to Chinon would test her resolve, but it would also begin the transformation of Joan from a village girl into the figure history would remember. The winter of 1429 carried Joan away from Domremy and into the dangerous world beyond her village. With her short hair hidden beneath a cap and her body clothed in men's garments, she rode with a small group of companions across hostile territory. The journey to Chinon was not only long but perilous, for enemy patrols and bandits haunted the roads. Each night they stopped at villages or slept under the stars, trusting in Joan's calm assurance that God would see them through. Despite her youth, she held herself with composure, praying quietly and urging her companions onward. Her determination seemed to shield them, and so they pressed forward, mile after mile. When at last the towers of Chinon rose before them, Joan's heart must have raced. Here resided Charles, the Dauphin, uncertain of his future, surrounded by advisers who doubted and whispered. She had come to speak words no one expected, and yet she was certain they were meant to be heard. At first her arrival drew little more than curiosity. She was a peasant girl in strange attire, claiming a mission from heaven. Courtiers scoffed, some laughed, and others warned Charles not to waste his time. Yet Charles, weary of defeat and searching for hope, agreed to test her. He devised a trick. He would not greet her in royal attire, but would stand among his courtiers in disguise. If she truly had divine guidance, she would recognize him without introduction. When Joan entered the great hall, Her eyes moved past the richly dressed lords, past the glitter and distraction, and came to rest directly on Charles, though he wore no crown and stood in plain clothing. She knelt before him and spoke with reverence, calling him the true heir of France. Those present were astonished. How could she know? Whispers swept the hall. Some called it a miracle, others a clever guess. But Charles himself felt something stir. He listened as Joan spoke of her mission, of her voices, of the saints who had sent her. She told him with calm certainty that he must go to Reims to be crowned, and that God had chosen her to lead him there. Charles hesitated, torn between scepticism and the strange comfort her words brought. In her presence, he felt a conviction he had not known for years. He tested her further, bringing priests and theologians to question her, to probe her story for falsehoods. Joan answered with clarity, sometimes with simple words, sometimes with profound insight. She confounded her critics not with clever arguments, but with unwavering sincerity. The Dauphin's court was divided. Many saw only danger in trusting a girl with such claims, but others whispered that perhaps she was the sign France had been waiting for. For Joan, there was no doubt. She had reached the one man who mattered, and she had spoken the message entrusted to her. Whatever doubts swirled around her, she stood firm, as steady as a flame that refuses to be blown out. The road ahead would demand more than words. It would demand action, armour, and battle. But in Chinon, before the Dauphin and his court, Joan had taken her first true step into history. After her meeting with Charles, Joan remained at Chinon for several weeks while the Dauphin's advisers debated her fate. Some were impressed by her courage and faith, while others dismissed her as a deluded girl. Yet Charles himself seemed reluctant to send her away. The court theologians questioned her again and again, searching for signs of heresy or deception. Each time she responded with calm clarity, speaking not with the polished words of scholars, but with the honesty of someone who believed completely in her mission. What surprised many was her composure. She was barely 17, standing before priests and noblemen, yet she never faltered. At last, the church authorities at Poitiers were asked to examine her more formally. They subjected her to days of questioning, probing into her visions, her morality, and her intentions. Instead of condemning her, they declared that there was nothing in her testimony contrary to the faith. To the surprise of many, they concluded that her words should be heeded, and that her claim of divine guidance could not be dismissed outright. This decision gave Charles a measure of confidence. Though he remained cautious, he allowed Joan to prepare for what she said must come, the lifting of the siege of Orléans. For months the city of Orléans had been under English attack, its people trapped, its supplies dwindling. If Orléans fell, the heart of France would be open to conquest, and Charles's hope of being crowned would vanish. Joan insisted that God had sent her to lead an army there, to bring relief and victory. The idea seemed impossible. She had never held a weapon in battle, never commanded soldiers, never ridden in war. Yet her conviction was unshaken. When Charles agreed to send her, preparations began in earnest. Joan was given a suit of armour, crafted to her size, and a white banner decorated with images of Christ and the fleur-de-lis of France. Unlike most warriors, she preferred not to carry a sword into combat. Instead, she raised her banner high, believing it was a symbol of God's will and a sign of hope for the men who followed her. To many, her appearance in armour was startling. She cut a striking figure, still youthful, yet carrying herself with dignity and strength. Soldiers who had grown weary of defeat felt a spark of something new when they looked at her. Some laughed, some doubted, but many were moved by her unyielding faith. When she spoke to them, it was not with the arrogance of a commander, but with the quiet fire of belief. She told them that God would give them victory if they fought with courage and righteousness. As her small army gathered, news spread quickly. A girl in armour, sent by God, marching to Orléans. Such a tale travelled faster than soldiers themselves. The people began to hope again, whispering that perhaps deliverance was near. In the spring of 1429, Joan mounted her horse, her banner fluttering above her, and set out with her army. The road ahead was filled with danger, but her heart was steady. She was no longer the hidden girl of Domremy, no longer the quiet voice in the shadows of Chinon. She was stepping fully into the role her voices had promised, a leader riding toward the fire of battle, carrying with her the faith of a nation. The march toward Orléans was unlike any ordinary military campaign. The army that gathered around Joan was not the largest France had ever seen, yet it carried with it a strange energy. Soldiers who had been weary from years of defeat now found themselves stirred by the sight of a young girl on horseback, clad in shining armour, her white banner fluttering against the sky. Many still doubted her, whispering that she was only a symbol, but even symbols can ignite courage. The road was long, the supplies heavy, and every step was shadowed by the threat of enemy scouts. Yet wherever Joan rode, she spoke to the men with gentleness and conviction, urging them to confess their sins, to avoid swearing, and to remember they fought not only for victory but for God's justice. Her presence alone seemed to steady them, turning hesitation into resolve. When the army neared Orléans, the reality of the siege came into view. English fortifications surrounded the city, their banners flying defiantly. For months the people within the walls had endured hunger and fear, watching the enemy tighten its grip. Relief seemed impossible, until word spread that a maiden had come to deliver them. Joan's arrival was not immediate triumph. The commanders argued, unsure of whether to risk direct battle. They questioned her experience, hesitated at her bold instructions, and tried to confine her role to encouragement. Yet Joan refused to be set aside. She rode among the men, visited the wounded, spoke to the citizens of Orléans, and carried her banner at the front lines. Her courage was quiet but unbreakable. When the first assaults on the English positions began, Joan did not hide behind the safety of walls. She stood in the thick of danger, lifting her banner high so that all could see it. Arrows flew, cannons roared, and the clash of steel filled the air, but she remained steady, urging the soldiers forward. It was not her sword that led them, but her unwavering faith. Over several days the French pressed harder, capturing fortifications one by one. The men, inspired by her certainty, fought with new determination. Even when she was wounded by an arrow in the shoulder, Joan refused to retreat. She returned to the fight as soon as the wound was dressed, her presence a living sign of perseverance. Slowly the siege began to turn. The English, who had thought themselves unshakable, now faced an enemy rekindled with spirit. The people of Orléans looked out from their battered walls and saw hope riding before them. When at last the English withdrew, lifting their siege, the city erupted in celebration. Bells rang, voices shouted, tears flowed freely. Against all odds, Orléans was free, and at the heart of the victory was Joan, the girl who had carried a banner and a faith stronger than fear. This moment marked the beginning of her transformation, from a village maiden into a national heroine. She had proven, not only to herself but to all of France, that her mission was no illusion. She had walked into the fire of battle and emerged as the figure her voices had promised, a deliverer whose presence could turn despair into triumph. The victory at Orléans spread across France like a spark carried on the wind. Villagers whispered her name, soldiers repeated her story, and nobles who had once dismissed her began to reconsider. Joan was no longer a strange curiosity at the Dauphin's court. She was now the Maiden of Orléans, the figure whose faith had broken a siege thought unbreakable. Yet for Joan herself, there was no time for celebration. Her voices told her clearly what must come next. The Dauphin, Charles, must go to Reims and be crowned as the rightful King of France. Without this sacred ceremony, his claim would remain weak, and the English and their allies would continue to challenge his authority. The road to Reims was long and filled with danger. To reach it, the French army would need to march through territory still held by the enemy, risking ambush and battle at every turn. But Joan's conviction gave courage to both soldiers and commanders. She reminded them again and again that God had chosen this path and that no obstacle could stand against divine will. For Charles, this was a decisive moment. He had long hesitated, doubted, and listened to advisers who urged caution. But with Joan beside him, he felt a new kind of certainty. She spoke to him not as a servant but as a messenger, with calm insistence that his destiny was waiting. At last he agreed. The army prepared for the march to Rheims, and Joan, still carrying her banner, rode at the front. Along the way, towns that had once resisted Charles began to open their gates. The sight of Joan inspired submission rather than defiance. Some places surrendered without a fight, convinced that to oppose her was to oppose God. Others required skirmishes, but each time the French pressed forward with renewed spirit. Slowly, the path to Rheims cleared. Inside the city, anticipation grew. Rheims was the traditional site of French coronations, the place where kings were anointed with holy oil, linking their rule to both history and heaven. To bring Charles there would be more than a political act. It would be a symbol that France was not broken, that its crown was blessed and defended. When the army finally reached the city in July 1429, the gates opened and the cathedral bells rang out. On July 17th, Charles entered Rheims Cathedral, surrounded by his court and guarded by his soldiers. As the archbishop anointed him and placed the crown upon his head, Joan stood nearby, her banner held high. For her, this was the fulfillment of her voice's command, the proof that her mission was real. She later said she would rather have her banner present at the coronation than her sword, for it was her banner that had led her through battle and victory. The coronation at Reims changed everything. Charles was now not just a claimant, but the crowned King of France. The people rejoiced, the soldiers cheered, and Joan wept with joy. She had seen with her own eyes the destiny she had been promised. Yet she also knew her journey was not finished. The war still raged, the English still held strongholds, and new trials awaited her. But in that moment, in the light of Reims Cathedral, the shepherd girl of Domremy had carried her king to his throne, and France believed again in its future. The coronation at Reims had filled France with hope, but Joan's mission did not end within the cathedral's walls. The war was still alive, its wounds deep, and the English remained powerful in the north. After the celebrations faded, Joan urged Charles to press forward, to seize Paris and solidify his claim. Yet here she faced a challenge she had not known before, hesitation from the very king she had helped to crown. Charles, though crowned, remained cautious, influenced by advisers who feared the risks of further campaigns. Joan pleaded with him, reminding him that God had guided them this far and would not abandon them now. But hesitation hung over the court like a heavy fog. Despite this, Joan was granted permission to lead another campaign. With her banner once again raised, she marched alongside French forces toward Paris, a city held tightly by English and Burgundian allies. The journey was tense, filled with both anticipation and doubt. Joan spoke to the soldiers with the same calm strength she always carried, urging them to confess, to pray, and to fight with clean hearts. She rode among them not as a distant figure but as one of their own, encouraging them in moments of weariness. When the army reached the outskirts of Paris, the scale of the task became clear. The defences were strong, the walls high, and the determination of the enemy fierce. Still, Joan believed victory was possible. She led assaults on the gates, her banner visible above the chaos. The fighting was brutal. Arrows darkened the sky, stones crashed down from the ramparts, and cries filled the air. In the midst of it, Joan pressed forward, urging her men on. Then came a moment that tested her resolve deeply. She was struck by a crossbow bolt, the iron piercing her thigh. She fell, wounded, and for a moment it seemed her spirit might falter. Yet even as blood stained her armour, she refused to leave. She urged the soldiers to continue, to trust in God, to take the city. They fought on, but the strength of the defences could not be overcome that day. At last, Joan was carried from the field, her body weakened, yet her spirit unbroken. The attempt on Paris had failed, and it was a bitter disappointment for her. Still, she did not despair. To her, setbacks were not signs of abandonment, but tests of faith. She believed the mission remained, that France could still be freed, that the voices which had guided her since childhood would not now turn away. For the soldiers who followed her, even in failure she remained a figure of light, wounded yet unyielding, a symbol that faith was stronger than walls of stone. The failure at Paris weighed heavily on Joan, yet she did not allow despair to settle in her heart. For her, each setback was simply another step in the long journey God had prepared. She continued to urge Charles and his advisers to take bold action, but the court grew more cautious. The king, now crowned, seemed less willing to risk his fragile position. Political concerns and negotiations with Burgundy pulled his attention away from Joan's fiery vision of victory. Still, she pressed on, seeking smaller campaigns to keep the spirit of the army alive. Over the next months, Joan rode with troops through towns and villages, liberating strongholds held by the enemy. In each place she entered, she inspired the people with her presence. To peasants and soldiers alike, she was not only a warrior, but also a reminder that France had not been abandoned by God. Bells rang when she arrived, crowds gathered, and voices called her the Maid of Orleans with reverence. Yet the challenges grew sharper. Resources were stretched thin, soldiers were weary, and Joan often found herself clashing with commanders who questioned her judgment. She was young, inexperienced in strategy, and yet carried a confidence that unsettled seasoned men. Some resented her influence, whispering that her victories had been luck or coincidence, but others continued to believe, strengthened by her calm persistence. Joan herself cared little for politics or pride. What mattered to her was obedience to the voices she trusted. Each morning she prayed, asking for strength, and each evening she gave thanks, no matter the outcome of the day's battles. Her life in the field was austere, simple meals, little rest, constant movement, but she bore it with serenity. The soldiers noticed, and even when morale faltered, her quiet endurance gave them courage. As the months passed, however, the limits of her power became clearer. She could not control the decisions of the court, and without full royal support, her campaigns often ended without decisive results. Still, Joan remained determined. To her, every skirmish, every town freed, every banner raised in defiance of the English was part of God's larger plan. She carried her mission like a flame against the wind, refusing to let it be extinguished. Though the road ahead was uncertain, she held fast to her belief that France would one day be free, and that her role, whatever its cost, was to see that promise fulfilled. Through the late months of 1429 and into 1430, Joan's mission grew more complicated. The glow of Reims and Orleans had not faded, but political tides shifted quickly. Charles, now crowned, listened more often to cautious advisers than to the maid who had carried him to his throne. Joan continued to press for bold campaigns, yet her voice was no longer the only one that mattered. Still, she remained restless, unwilling to retreat into silence. Her voices urged her to act, and she believed her duty had not ended. In the early spring of 1430, news reached her of danger in the north. The Burgundians, allies of the English, were threatening the region of Compiègne. Joan resolved to go there, to defend the city and its people. Gathering a small force, she rode once more, her banner lifted against the uncertain sky. The journey was difficult, the soldiers fewer, the supplies thinner than in earlier days. Yet Joan's presence remained the same, steady, prayerful, unyielding. When she entered Compiègne, the citizens welcomed her with relief. To them, she was still the figure of hope, the maiden who had broken the siege of Orleans. They trusted that with her among them, the city might endure. Soon after her arrival, the Burgundians laid siege. The fighting was fierce, and Joan rode constantly along the walls, encouraging defenders, calming fears, and reminding them of God's presence even in the roar of battle. On May 23rd, 1430, she led a sortie outside the gates, striking boldly against the enemy. At first, the attack carried strength, but soon the French were overwhelmed. As the retreat sounded and the gates closed behind the last of the defenders, Joan was still outside. Surrounded, she fought with courage, but there was no escape. The Burgundians seized her, dragging her from her horse. The capture of Joan of Arc echoed like thunder across France. For her followers, it was unthinkable that the girl who had led them with such certainty could now be a prisoner. For her enemies, it was a triumph, a chance to discredit not only Joan but also the king whose crown she'd carried to Reims. Joan herself met captivity with calm. She had always known her mission carried risk, and though she longed for freedom, she did not cry out in despair. Instead, she placed her trust once more in the voices that had guided her since childhood. Her fate was now out of her hands, but her spirit remained steady. What lay ahead would be darker than any battle, yet it was a trial she would endure with the same quiet faith. Joan's capture at Compiègne marked the turning of her story into tragedy. Taken by the Burgundians, she was held under guard while her captors decided her fate. For weeks, rumours swirled. Would she be ransomed, exchanged, or executed in secret? The answer soon became clear. She would be sold to the English, who viewed her as a dangerous enemy and a tool of propaganda. For 10,000 livres, an enormous sum, she was delivered into their hands. From that moment, Joan ceased to be only a soldier or a symbol of hope. She became a prisoner whose trial would be used to break the spirit of France itself. The English were determined not only to silence her but also to discredit her. If they could prove her a heretic, then her victories would seem the work of deception, not divine guidance. Her capture was more than military. It was political, spiritual and symbolic. Joan was taken to Rouen, the centre of English power in Normandy. There she was confined in a dark stone prison, guarded constantly by soldiers. Unlike noble prisoners, who were often treated with dignity, she was denied even basic comforts. She was shackled, watched day and night, and placed in the custody of men who often jeered at her. Yet even in chains, Joan remained composed. She prayed, she endured, and she carried herself with the same quiet strength that had marked her days in battle. Her trial was arranged by Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, who sought to please the English. The proceedings were cloaked in the appearance of legality, but their purpose was clear: to condemn Joan not as a prisoner of war but as a heretic. If they succeeded, Charles's coronation at Reims would seem tainted, and English claims to the French crown would be strengthened. In February 1431 the questioning began. Day after day, Joan was brought before a panel of learned clerics, men who surrounded her with books, arguments, and traps of language. She was only 19, untrained in theology, yet she answered with remarkable clarity. When they pressed her on her visions, she spoke calmly of St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret. She insisted that God had guided her, that her mission had always been for his glory. When they asked if she believed herself in God's grace, a question meant to condemn her no matter her answer, she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." Her words silenced even her accusers. Despite the intimidation, Joan did not break. Though she was weary, ill, and constantly threatened, she remained steadfast. The trial stretched on for months, filled with accusations, trick questions, and pressure. The men around her hoped she would falter, but she carried herself with dignity. For Joan, the courtroom was not so different from the battlefield. It was another struggle where courage and faith mattered more than strength of arms, and as before, she refused to yield. The months of Joan's trial were a slow battle of endurance. Each session tested her patience, her memory, and her faith. The clerics who questioned her tried to twist her words, asking about her visions in ways designed to trap her. They hoped she would contradict herself or speak rashly. Yet Joan responded with remarkable steadiness. She admitted freely to her voices, never denying the saints who guided her. At times she even smiled gently at their attempts, as though she saw through their designs. Her youth was evident, but so was her courage. She had once faced swords and arrows, now she faced questions sharpened like blades. The trial records, carefully written by her judges, reveal not only her words but also their surprise. They expected a frightened girl, but instead they found someone who answered with calm intelligence. She spoke of her mission with clarity. She had come to raise the siege of Orléans and to bring Charles to Rheims. That, she said, had been accomplished. Everything else was in God's hands. Though imprisoned, she retained a dignity that unsettled her accusers. Yet the pressure was relentless. They accused her of dressing in men's clothes, of disobedience, of claiming revelations that went beyond the church. They painted her voices as lies, or worse, as the work of demons. Joan listened, then answered in her quiet voice that she knew her visions came from God. She would not deny them. Her resilience amazed some who witnessed the trial. Even English soldiers guarding her grew uneasy, whispering that she must indeed be favoured by heaven to withstand such treatment. Still, the judges pressed on. They placed before her complex questions of theology. Joan, untrained in scholarship, did not answer as a university master would, but with direct honesty. When they asked about obedience to the church, she said she loved the church, yet her first obedience was to God. Her answers were both simple and profound, revealing a faith too deep to be shaken by clever traps. Despite this, the outcome was never in doubt. The English wanted condemnation, and Pierre Cauchon was determined to give it. Behind the mask of legality, the decision had already been written. What Joan endured was not a fair hearing, but a slow unfolding of judgment. Still, she did not despair. In the dark of her cell, she prayed. In the hall of questions, she spoke with calm. She was weary, often ill, and sometimes near breaking. Yet each morning she rose again to face her accusers. Her battlefields had changed, but her spirit had not. The same flame that had led her to Orléans now sustained her in chains. As spring turned to early summer of 1431, Joan's trial entered its final stages. Weeks of questioning had passed, yet her answers remained steady, frustrating her judges. They sought not only her condemnation, but also her submission, hoping she would recount her visions and admit to error. Still, Joan resisted, her faith unbroken. She longed for freedom, for the open air and the sound of church bells, yet she knew her fate was closing in. One of the harshest accusations against her was her choice of clothing. From the time she had left Domremy, she had worn men's garments for protection. In the eyes of the court, this became a crime against the natural order, a sign of rebellion. Joan explained simply that her attire was necessary, that among soldiers it kept her safe, but to her judges it became a symbol of her defiance. They pressed her again and again to change her clothes, hoping to use it as proof of disobedience. Joan's strength weakened at times under the weight of fear. She was 19, alone, and constantly threatened with execution. In moments of despair, she wavered. At one point, worn down by threats of torture and burning, she signed a document she may not have fully understood, agreeing to renounce her visions and to wear women's clothing. Her judges celebrated, believing they had broken her spirit. Yet Joan's heart could not betray what she knew. Within days she returned to her male attire, declaring that her voices had reproached her for denying them. She chose once more the path of truth, though it meant certain death. The court seized upon this. By resuming her clothing and refusing to deny her visions, she had, in their eyes, relapsed into heresy. That sealed her sentence. On May 30th, 1431, Joan was led from her cell at Rouen to the marketplace where a stake awaited. The morning was heavy with silence. Crowds gathered, some curious, some grieving, others triumphant. She was bound to the post, her head lifted, her eyes fixed on a cross held before her. Witnesses said she prayed softly, calling upon Jesus until the very end. When the fire rose, smoke filled the square, and her voice faded into the air. The executioners reduced her body to ashes, scattering them into the Seine so no relic could be preserved. Yet though her body was gone, her spirit endured. Those who had seen her courage could not forget. Even some of her enemies whispered that a saint had been burned that day. For France, Her death was not the end, but the beginning of a legend that would only grow stronger with time. In the days following Joan's death, Rouen was heavy with unease. Those who had gathered to witness her execution carried away memories that would not fade. Some spoke of the courage in her voice, others of the way she fixed her gaze upon the cross until the flames consumed her. Even hardened soldiers admitted they felt shaken, as though something holy had slipped from the world. The English had meant her death to destroy her reputation, yet instead it gave her story a strange, luminous power. News travelled quickly. Across France, peasants and townspeople whispered that the Maid of Orléans had been wronged. She had lifted sieges, crowned a king, and fought with faith, only to be condemned by men who feared her. For many, her death was not a defeat, but a seed of martyrdom. In Domremy, her home village, bells tolled and prayers were offered for the girl they had once known as simply Joan. To those who had seen her ride into battle, she became larger than life, a figure of memory and myth. Charles VII, the king she had carried to Reims, said little. Political caution bound him, yet he too could not escape the truth. Without Joan, his crown might never have been placed upon his head. Her absence left a silence at his side, one that no adviser could fill. In the years that followed, France slowly regained ground. Victories came, cities were reclaimed, and the English were pushed back. Yet behind these events, Joan's shadow lingered. Soldiers who fought spoke of her courage as though it still guided them. Her name became a banner in itself, a reminder that one humble girl had turned the course of war. Though she was gone, she lived on in the hearts of those who believed. Her trial, too, was remembered. Many began to question its fairness, to wonder whether justice had truly been served. Whispers grew louder. Had not the judges twisted her words? Had they not condemned her more for politics than for faith? In time, these doubts would rise to the surface, but even in the first years after her death, people sensed the injustice. They prayed for her soul, but many also prayed to her quietly, as though she were already a saint. The English had scattered her ashes into the river to erase her memory, but rivers carry things farther than men can imagine. Joan's story flowed outward, carried in voices, in songs, in prayers, until it became part of the living spirit of France. Years passed after Joan's execution, yet her memory did not fade. In villages and towns across France, stories of the Maid were told at hearthsides, in marketplaces, and in the quiet of churches. Children who had never seen her in life grew up hearing of the girl who had freed Orléans and carried a king to his crown. For the common people, Joan became more than a warrior. She was a symbol that God had not abandoned them, even in the darkest years of war. Her legend spread in whispers, in songs, and in the simple faith of peasants who believed she had been chosen for a divine purpose. Meanwhile, the war itself continued. Charles VII slowly strengthened his position, reclaiming lands and building alliances. His reign gained stability, but always behind him was the memory of Joan. Though he rarely spoke her name, the coronation at Reims remained the turning point of his rule, and all knew it had been made possible by the Maid. In quiet ways, her spirit was still guiding France. Among soldiers, her courage became an example. They recalled how she had stood with them, banner in hand, unafraid of arrows and fire. They remembered her prayers before battle, her refusal to abandon the wounded, and the way her calm presence had lifted despair. Even when commanders argued, they would sometimes invoke her name, as though her memory could still settle disputes. In Domremy, her village, her family lived with both grief and pride. They were peasants still, but their daughter's story had reached beyond borders. Pilgrims began to visit, seeking to see the place where Joan had first heard her voices. To them, Domremy was no longer just a quiet village, but the cradle of a saint. Yet her enemies too remembered. For the English, Joan's name became a haunting reminder of their losses. They had hoped her death would erase her influence, but instead it had made her larger than life. Some English soldiers swore they had seen a sign of holiness in her final moments, and such stories unsettled even the victors. Time, however, has a way of revealing truths. As years turned into decades, more began to question the trial that condemned her. Was it truly justice, or was it a mask for politics and fear? The thought lingered, slowly shaping the future. For though Joan's life had ended in flames, her story was only beginning to grow, and the world was not finished with the Maid of Orleans. By the middle of the 15th century, France had changed. The tide of war shifted, the English grip loosened, and Charles VII grew into a stronger monarch. Yet even as victories mounted, the memory of Joan of Arc remained unsettled. For many, her death was a wound that had never healed, and whispers about the injustice of her trial continued to circulate. Priests, villagers, and even nobles asked themselves whether God's messenger had been silenced by the schemes of men. The thought lingered, quietly but persistently, until it could no longer be ignored. In 1450, 19 years after Joan's death, Charles authorised an investigation into her trial. The decision was not only political, but also deeply human. By then, the king understood that his legitimacy was forever tied to the maid who had brought him to Reims. If she had been condemned as a heretic, what did that say about the crown she had placed upon his head? Clearing her name was not only justice for Joan, but also strength for France itself. The investigation gathered testimonies from those who had known her. Soldiers who had fought at Orleans spoke of her courage, her piety, and her leadership. Villagers from Domremy recalled her devotion and purity. Even clerics admitted that her trial had been deeply flawed, shaped by English pressure rather than truth. Slowly the picture became clear. Joan had been condemned not for heresy, but for politics. The voices that had guided her could not be judged by men whose motives were clouded by fear and ambition. The process of rehabilitation stretched across decades, gathering evidence and weighing testimony. At last, in 1456, a formal retrial declared Joan innocent of her charges. The earlier verdict was annulled, her name restored, and her memory honoured. In the Cathedral of Rouen, the same city where she had been executed, her innocence was proclaimed with solemnity. For her family, it was a moment of profound vindication. For France, it was the closing of a wound. Yet Joan's story did not rest there. Even cleared of guilt, she lived on as more than a historical figure. She became a legend, a symbol of courage, faith, and the mysterious ways of destiny. Over time, she would become not only a heroine of France, but also a saint of the Church. The flames that had consumed her body could not consume her spirit, and history itself began to lift her higher than even she might have imagined. The retrial of 1456 did more than clear Joan's name. It transformed her into a figure larger than life. No longer was she seen as a condemned heretic. Now she was honoured as a woman who had suffered unjustly and remained faithful until the end. The image of Joan began to change from that of a warrior to that of a martyr. Her story retold with reverence in churches, in villages, and in the halls of kings. For the people of France, she became a reminder that truth could outlast lies, and that even in defeat, the light of faith could not be extinguished. Her family, who had lived under the shadow of her condemnation, now walked with pride. They had watched her burn, powerless to intervene, but now they could hold their heads high, knowing that the church itself had declared her innocent. In Domremy, pilgrims began to arrive in greater numbers. They came to see the place where the maid had grown, to touch the earth she had walked upon, and to pray where she had once prayed. Her childhood village became a place of memory, carrying within it the quiet echoes of her voice. Over the decades that followed, her story was passed on from generation to generation. Minstrels sang of her victories, priests preached of her faith, and mothers told their children of the girl who had risen from the fields to save a nation. Each retelling added something new, shaping her legend into something more than history. Joan of Arc became not only a figure of the past, but also a living presence in the soul of France. Wars continued, kings rose and fell, and the centuries turned, yet her memory endured. In times of danger, her name was invoked as a protector. In times of despair, she was remembered as a symbol of hope. For women, she became an example of courage beyond the limits of her age. For men, she became proof that strength was not found only in weapons, but in conviction. Though her canonization by the Church was still far in the future, the people already treated her as a saint. They prayed to her in secret, lit candles in her honour, and carried her image in their hearts. Slowly, her story crossed borders as well. Beyond France, others began to speak of the maid who had heard voices, who had led armies, and who had faced death without fear. In her they saw something universal, the power of faith, the strength of youth, and the mystery of destiny. Joan's journey, once bound to the soil of Domremy and the battlefields of France, now belonged to the world. As the centuries moved forward, Joan's story grew roots in the imagination of Europe. In France, she was remembered in chronicles and local tales, while in neighbouring lands her name carried an air of mystery. To some, she was the strange peasant girl who had dared to lead armies. To others, she was a chosen figure whose faith outshone the power of kings. Over time, artists began to paint her image. Poets wove her into verses, and playwrights drew upon her life for inspiration. Each portrayal shaped her legend in new ways, sometimes as a warrior, sometimes as a martyr, and sometimes as a saintly figure bathed in divine light. The truth of her life remained clear enough. Her childhood in Domremy, her voices, her victories, her trial, her death. But the meanings people drew from it shifted with the times. During the 16th and 17th centuries, France itself was torn by new conflicts, religious wars, civil strife, and struggles for power. Yet even then, Joan remained a figure who seemed to belong to everyone. Catholics honoured her faith and her obedience to God, while others admired her courage and her defiance of injustice. In moments when the nation fractured, her story reminded people of unity and destiny. Domremy continued to attract visitors. The village church where Joan had prayed became a place of pilgrimage, and her family's home was preserved as a relic of her humble origins. Travellers wrote of the feeling of walking where she once walked, of standing in the fields that had shaped her youth. To touch that soil was to feel connected to the mystery of her calling. As her memory spread, so too did the recognition that she had been extraordinary, not because she sought glory, but because she obeyed what she believed to be divine command. Unlike kings or generals, Joan had no personal ambition. She asked for no titles, claimed no wealth, and sought only to serve. This purity of intention gave her story a resonance that few others carried. By the 18th century, her image had taken on a patriotic glow. Philosophers, dramatists, and historians looked back upon her as a national heroine, someone who embodied the courage of ordinary people rising in defence of their land. Even as France marched toward new revolutions and upheavals, the story of the Maid of Orleans stood as a reminder of how faith and determination could change the course of history. Joan's voice, silenced in Rouen, had become louder than ever, echoing across generations and borders. By the 19th century, Joan of Arc's memory rose to new prominence. France, recovering from the storms of revolution and the rise and fall of empires, looked back upon her story with renewed admiration. Writers and thinkers of the Romantic era, captivated by figures of passion and destiny, found in Joan the perfect heroine. She was at once historical and mythical, a real girl from Domremy, yet also a timeless symbol of purity, courage, and sacrifice. Her life was taken up in books, poems, and plays, and her image adorned paintings and sculptures. To the French people, she became more than a distant memory. She became a mirror in which they could see themselves, their struggles, and their hopes. In 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte declared her a national symbol, honouring her as an emblem of unity and courage. He understood her power not only as a saintly figure but also as a rallying point for the French spirit. Statues were erected in her honour, festivals celebrated her name, and soldiers carried her image into battle as a protector of the nation. Across Europe, her story spread, translated into many languages. Scholars debated her visions, artists reimagined her battles, and poets wrote of her martyrdom. Each age seemed to find in her something that spoke to its own longings. For some, she was the warrior maiden. For others, the innocent victim. For others still, the saint touched by heaven. What never faded was the sense that Joan's life carried a mystery beyond explanation, a destiny woven into history by unseen hands. The Catholic Church too began to take renewed interest in her cause. Though she had been declared innocent in the retrial of 1456, she was not yet formally canonized. For centuries the people had treated her as a saint in their hearts, but official recognition had not yet come. By the 19th century, voices within the Church grew stronger in calling for her canonization. The process was long, requiring careful examination of her life, her trial, and the miracles attributed to her intercession. But slowly, momentum built. Joan was no longer just the Maid of Orleans. She was becoming a figure whose holiness was acknowledged beyond national borders. As the century closed, her path towards sainthood grew clearer, and France, divided by politics and wars, found in her a unifying light. She reminded people that greatness could rise from simplicity, and that faith could transform even the most fragile life into a beacon for the ages. As the 20th century approached, the movement to recognise Joan of Arc as a saint gathered unstoppable force. For centuries she had been loved by the people, honoured by soldiers, and remembered in the prayers of the faithful. Yet official canonisation required patience, investigation, and the approval of the highest authorities in the Catholic Church. Her case was reopened formally in the late 1800s, with theologians revisiting the records of her trial, her retrial, and the many testimonies of her purity and courage. Every line of parchment, every remembered word, every detail of her life was examined with care. Nothing in her actions suggested heresy or deceit. Instead, her story reflected obedience, humility, and unwavering faith. In 1909, Joan was beatified, the first great step towards sainthood. The ceremony drew crowds who wept as her name was lifted into honour. For the people of France, it was not simply a religious moment, but a national one. Their maid, once burned as a heretic, was now declared blessed by the very church that had once condemned her. The contrast was powerful, a sign that truth had prevailed over injustice. Yet the journey did not end there. Over the next decade, devotion to Joan grew even stronger. Pilgrims travelled to Domremy, to Orléans, to Rouen, leaving offerings and prayers. Soldiers spoke her name before battle, particularly during the horrors of the First World War. To men in muddy trenches, she was a sister, a protector, someone who understood sacrifice. Her image appeared on posters, medals, and small prayer cards carried in pockets. Then, in 1920, nearly 5 centuries after her death, Joan of Arc was canonised as a saint by Pope Benedict XV. The ceremony in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome brought together French pilgrims, clergy, and thousands who had long waited for this recognition. At last, Joan was officially declared St. Joan of Arc, the warrior saint, the girl who had become a symbol not only for France but for the entire Catholic world. Her feast day was set for May 30th, the anniversary of her martyrdom. The timing was profound. France, wounded by the Great War, found in Joan a reminder of resilience, faith, and the power of courage. Statues rose in her honour, churches bore her name, and her story was retold in every corner of the country. Joan, who had once been bound in chains and silenced by fire, now stood free in the hearts of millions. Her sainthood confirmed what generations had already believed, that she was chosen, that she was holy, and that her life was a testament to the mystery of divine will. The canonisation of Joan of Arc in 1920 was not the end of her story, but the opening of a new chapter. At last she was recognised not only as a national heroine but as a universal saint, a figure whose courage and faith belonged to all people. Across France, celebrations filled the streets. Bells rang in villages, choirs sang in cathedrals, and children carried banners with her image. For a nation scarred by war, her canonisation felt like healing. The First World War had left deep wounds. Fields turned to graves, cities shattered, families mourning. Yet in Joan, the French people saw resilience. She had suffered, she had endured, and she had never abandoned her mission. Soldiers who had marched through trenches whispered prayers to her. Now those prayers seemed answered as she was lifted to sainthood. Beyond France, her recognition spread like light across borders. Catholic communities worldwide celebrated her as an example of youthful courage and faith. Schools took her name, parishes were founded in her honour, and stained glass windows glowed with her image. In Italy, Spain, the Americas, and even distant lands, Joan became a symbol of hope in uncertain times. Writers of the 20th century, too, found inspiration in her story. George Bernard Shaw wrote his famous play St. Joan, portraying her as a figure of conscience and vision. Historians examined her trial anew, marvelling at the intelligence of her answers. Painters and sculptors continued to capture her likeness, from majestic statues in Paris to small devotional icons in rural chapels. Each work revealed another face of Joan: warrior, shepherdess, martyr, saint. In France, her feast day of May 30th became an occasion of national pride. Pilgrims travelled to Orléans to walk the same streets she once freed. Others visited Domremy, seeking the quiet fields where her journey began. Rouen, the place of her death, became a site of prayer and reflection, its marketplace marked by memorials that turned sorrow into reverence. Over time, Joan's story grew beyond even faith and nation. Feminists saw in her a figure of strength, a woman who defied the limits of her age and stood equal to men in courage. Leaders saw in her an emblem of patriotism, a reminder that love of country could be expressed through sacrifice. To many ordinary people, she remained what she had always been, a girl of deep faith who trusted her calling, no matter the cost. As the 20th century unfolded, wars and crises continued, but Joan's presence seemed to grow stronger with each generation. She was no longer only the Maid of Orléans or the Saint of France. She had become a timeless companion for all who sought courage in the face of fear and light in the midst of darkness. As the 20th century moved forward, Joan of Arc's image continued to evolve, adapting to the hopes and struggles of each generation. During the Second World War, both resistance fighters and ordinary citizens looked to her as a source of strength. France, once again invaded and occupied, remembered the girl who had stood against foreign powers with nothing but faith and determination. Posters of Joan appeared on walls, her figure in armour painted as a guardian of freedom. The resistance whispered her name in secret meetings, invoking her courage as they fought against overwhelming odds. To them, Joan was not simply a saint of the past, but a companion in their own struggle for liberation. When liberation finally came in 1944, many felt that her spirit had marched with them, that the Maid of Orléans had once again helped to free her country. Beyond wartime, Joan became a unifying figure in moments of division. Political groups of every persuasion claimed her as their own, seeing in her qualities that matched their ideals. For some, she was the symbol of a strong and sovereign France. For others, she was a champion of the poor, a humble peasant girl who defied power. The Church continued to honour her feast, while secular voices celebrated her as a national heroine. Few figures in history managed to cross so many boundaries, but Joan belonged to all. In art and literature, her presence grew still more vibrant. Films brought her story to the screen, from grand historical epics to intimate portrayals of her trial. Each director sought to capture the mystery of her life. Was she a visionary chosen by God, a genius of leadership, or a symbol created by history? Audiences watched her story unfold in darkened theatres, moved by her courage, her suffering, and her unwavering light. In classrooms, children studied her as both history and legend. Teachers spoke of the 100 Years' War, of Orléans, of Rouen, but also of her faith and the voices that guided her. For many young students, Joan became a first introduction to the idea that one life, however humble, can alter the course of nations. Pilgrimage sites tied to her memory flourished in the 20th century. Orléans held annual festivals in her honour, with processions, prayers and celebrations that drew thousands. Domremy became a place of quiet reflection, its fields still carrying the memory of a shepherd girl who had once heard voices of saints. Rouen, once the place of her execution, now carried her legacy with reverence rather than shame. Through all these expressions, Joan remained timeless. She belonged not only to her century but to every century, not only to France but to the world. Her story spoke of courage beyond fear, of faith beyond doubt, and of destiny beyond death. In the later decades of the 20th century, Joan of Arc's story became a bridge between faith, culture, and modern identity. As the world changed rapidly with technology, politics, and new conflicts, her image endured as something ancient yet ever relevant. The Church upheld her as a saint, whose feast inspired reflection on courage and obedience to God. At the same time, artists, writers, and even political leaders continued to reinterpret her life for their own times. In France, annual celebrations in Orléans became more than historical reenactments. They were affirmations of national pride, moments when citizens gathered to honour the Maid not only as a figure of the past, but as a living part of their heritage. Parades filled the streets, banners waved, choirs sang, and children dressed as Joan marched proudly. The festivities drew tourists from across the world, and for a few days each year the city seemed to breathe with her spirit again. Globally, Joan inspired movements far beyond France. In the United States, her image appeared in churches, schools, and even literature, admired as a symbol of youthful bravery and independence. Women's movements pointed to her as proof that gender could not limit strength or leadership. Young people especially saw in her someone close to their own age who had accomplished extraordinary things without wealth or status. Filmmakers returned to her story again and again. Each version highlighted different facets: her mysticism, her leadership, her trial, or her humanity. Some films focused on the grandeur of battles, while others lingered on the quiet moments of faith and doubt. The diversity of portrayals revealed just how wide her legacy had become. No single telling could contain her completely. Scholars, too, found in Joan a figure worth endless study. Historians examined the politics of her trial, theologians explored the meaning of her visions, and psychologists debated the nature of her voices. Each discipline saw her through a different lens, yet all agreed that she was remarkable. Joan resisted being reduced to one category. She was a peasant, a leader, a prisoner, a martyr, and a saint, all at once. As the century moved into its final years, her presence remained steady. She was invoked in speeches, depicted in art, celebrated in music, and studied in classrooms. She stood as both mystery and inspiration, never confined to the 15th century but alive in every new generation. The world, shifting and uncertain, still looked to Joan as a reminder that conviction could stand against power, that faith could endure even in fire, and that one life could shine across centuries. As the 21st century opened, Joan of Arc remained as alive in the imagination of the world as she had ever been. More than 500 years had passed since her birth, yet her story was not fading. It was expanding. In an age of rapid communication, digital archives, and global connection, her image travelled farther than any army she once led. Museums displayed manuscripts of her trial, allowing visitors to read the very words she had spoken in Rouen. Scholars published new studies, each generation re-examining her with fresh questions. Was she a mystic touched by God, a brilliant leader born from circumstance, or both? The mystery that surrounded her in life continued to spark debate in classrooms, lecture halls, and bookshelves. In France, Joan remained a national symbol, but her meaning evolved with the times. To some, she was the saint who embodied faith. To others, the patriot who defended her homeland. To still others, a feminist icon who transcended the expectations of her age. Politicians invoked her name in speeches, artists reimagined her in paintings and theatre, and young people studied her story as proof that greatness can come from the most unlikely of places. Every May, Orléans continued its tradition of celebrating her deliverance of the city, a ritual that bound the past to the present. Pilgrims walked the streets, banners waved, and the bells rang as though echoing the joy of 1429. Domremy, her birthplace, remained a place of pilgrimage, its quiet fields and preserved home offering a connection to the humble origins of the girl who changed history. Rouen, once a place of sorrow, became one of reflection. The site of her execution was transformed into a memorial and church, where prayers rose not in condemnation but in gratitude. Technology gave her story new life. Films and documentaries reached global audiences, spreading her legacy to those who might never travel to France. Video games, novels, and even music drew upon her image, shaping her into a figure of imagination as much as of history. For believers, she remained a saint whose prayers could be sought in times of need. For secular admirers, she remained a symbol of courage, resistance, and the human spirit's resilience. Across cultures and continents, her name carried weight. Teachers introduced her to students in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, not as a distant European figure but as a universal one. Joan belonged to the world now, and her voice, once heard in a small village in France, echoed across the globe. As the modern world struggled with new uncertainties, her story remained steady, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, a single life, guided by conviction, can light the way. In the modern world, Joan of Arc stands at the intersection of history, faith, and culture. She is remembered not only in churches and cathedrals, but also in novels, films, and classrooms, each generation shaping her story in new ways. In France, she remains a figure of unity, claimed by Catholics, patriots, feminists, and even secular voices who see in her a symbol of human strength. That a single girl from a small village could inspire so many different meanings is itself a testament to her enduring power. Her canonization as a saint places her firmly within the spiritual tradition of the Church, yet her image extends beyond religious boundaries. In paintings, she's often shown armoured yet serene, a blend of strength and innocence. Sculptors capture her with sword or banner, her gaze lifted toward heaven. Writers linger on her words, especially the moments in her trial, when she answered questions with simplicity that disarmed her judges. "I am not afraid," she once said. "I was born to do this." These words echo across centuries, printed in books, carved in stone, and whispered in prayer. Technology ensures her story is never far away. Virtual exhibits allow people to step inside Rouen marketplace or walk the streets of Orléans as if they were there in the 15th century. Films retell her story with new interpretations, some emphasizing her mysticism, others her patriotism, still others her humanity. Each version, however, returns to the same central truth. Joan was extraordinary, not because she sought power, but because she obeyed what she believed was right. In schools, her life is taught as both history and inspiration. Teachers present her not only as a figure of war, but as an example of conviction. For young students, the idea that a teenager could shape the destiny of nations is powerful. It shows that courage is not limited by age, gender, or station in life. Around the world, people draw upon her story for strength. In times of crisis, she is invoked as a symbol of resilience. In times of doubt, she is remembered as a guide who trusted her calling, even when it led to fire. Joan belongs to history, yet she also belongs to the present, for her message is timeless. The world changes, but the need for courage, faith, and hope never fades. And so, 5 centuries after her death, Joan of Arc continues to live not as ashes scattered in the Seine, but as a light carried forward by each generation, a warrior saint whose flame cannot be extinguished. Joan of Arc's legacy in the 21st century has grown beyond what anyone in her own time could have imagined. She has become a universal figure, transcending religion, politics, and even nationality. In France, she remains deeply cherished, but her presence now extends across continents, woven into the shared culture of humanity. Schools on every continent teach her story as a lesson in courage. Museums preserve her artifacts, from fragments of armour to the ancient trial manuscripts, allowing visitors to stand inches away from history. Cathedrals display stained glass with her likeness, a warrior maiden shining in coloured light, reminding worshippers that holiness can appear in unexpected forms. The city of Orléans still holds its annual festival each May, commemorating the lifting of the siege in 1429. Processions fill the streets, flags wave, and reenactments bring to life the moment when Joan carried hope into the city. Children dress as soldiers and saints, bells echo through the air, and modern citizens walk the same paths their ancestors once did, bound together by memory. In Domremy, her birthplace, the countryside still holds a sense of quiet reverence. Visitors step into the small stone house where she was born, feeling the weight of history in the humble rooms. The church where she prayed remains a place of pilgrimage, not grand or imposing, but simple, like Joan herself. It is here that many pause to reflect on how a girl of such modest beginnings could shape the fate of kingdoms. Rouen, where she faced her trial and death, has become both a memorial and a lesson. The marketplace where she was burned now holds a modern church dedicated to her memory, its soaring architecture symbolizing flames that rise upward, not to destroy, but to light the heavens. Inside, candles burn in silence, offered by pilgrims who see in Joan not only tragedy, but transformation. Scholars continue to debate the nature of her voices. Some argue they were mystical experiences, visions granted by God. Others suggest they were the product of an extraordinary imagination or psychological strength. Yet whatever their origin, they led Joan to acts that changed history. For many, the mystery itself is part of her appeal. She cannot be explained away neatly, and so she continues to inspire awe. In art, Joan's story is retold endlessly. Writers craft novels from her perspective, filmmakers portray her struggle, musicians compose pieces that echo her courage. Each generation remakes her in its own image, yet her essence never fades. She is always the shepherd girl, the warrior, the prisoner, the martyr, the saint. Her meaning shifts with time, but her presence remains steady. In an age often marked by skepticism and uncertainty, Joan's story still cuts through the noise. She reminds us that conviction can carry an ordinary person into extraordinary deeds, and that even in defeat, one can triumph by remaining true to one's calling. The Seine carried her ashes away, but the world still holds her spirit close. She is not forgotten. She is everywhere, still whispering courage into hearts that need it. Today, Joan of Arc is more than a saint remembered in prayer or a heroine celebrated in history books. She's become a cultural icon whose story is retold in countless ways, from the solemn halls of churches to the creative realms of literature, theatre, film, and even digital media. Each new century shapes her image, but the heart of her story remains unchanged. A young girl, guided by faith and conviction, who altered the destiny of her nation and captured the imagination of the world. In France, she remains one of the most beloved national figures. Streets, schools, and squares bear her name. Statues rise in city centres, depicting her in armour with banner lifted high, a reminder that the spirit of courage can take many forms. Each May in Orléans, the city rejoices in her memory, blending tradition with celebration. Costumes, processions, reenactments, and solemn masses all honour the maid who freed their ancestors centuries ago. Tourists gather alongside locals, proving that her story is not only history but living heritage. In Domremy, the quiet village where she was born, time seems to stand still. Her family's home is preserved as a national monument, and visitors can walk through the rooms that once sheltered her childhood. The surrounding fields stretch wide and open, much as they did when she tended sheep and first heard the voices that would change her life. The village, though small, carries a weight far greater than its size, for it is tied forever to one of the most extraordinary lives ever lived. Rouen, where her life ended, has transformed sorrow into remembrance. The site of her execution is now marked by the Church of St. Joan of Arc, its modern architecture rising like flames. Pilgrims and tourists alike stand in silence there, reflecting not only on her death, but on her triumph over injustice. Her ashes may have been scattered into the Seine, but her presence fills the city with reverence. Beyond France, Joan's story resonates in every corner of the globe. In America, she's admired as a symbol of independence and youthful bravery. In Asia, her story is taught as an example of resilience and purpose. Across cultures, she is proof that destiny is not bound by age, gender, or class. Writers continue to explore her mystery. Was she a saint touched by God, a brilliant strategist, a symbol crafted by history? Perhaps she was all of these, for Joan resists being contained by any single explanation. Musicians compose works in her honour, artists paint her anew, and filmmakers reinterpret her life for modern audiences. Even in digital spaces, her figure appears, in games, animations, and online discussions, ensuring that her memory endures in forms her own century could never have imagined. For believers, she remains a powerful intercessor, a saint who understands sacrifice and courage. For others, she's a timeless example of what faith in a cause can achieve. Joan's life speaks to soldiers and dreamers, to leaders and the humble, to all who have faced doubt and fear. Her journey from Domremy to the flames of Rouen continues to inspire, teaching that the light of conviction can burn brighter than the fire of execution. The story of Joan of Arc in the modern imagination is not just about faith or patriotism, but about the enduring mystery of human courage. She has become a figure studied in schools not only for her role in French history, but for the universal question she raises. What does it mean to follow a calling? How can one young person alter the course of nations? And why does her story continue to resonate across centuries, cultures, and beliefs? Historians approach her with the tools of scholarship, piecing together documents from her trial, letters written by those who knew her, and chronicles of her time. They marvel at how a girl from a remote village stepped into the centres of power with such certainty. Psychologists examine her visions, debating whether they were mystical encounters, extraordinary imagination, or something science cannot yet explain. Theologians see in her obedience to her voices the very essence of faith, to trust when logic falters, to believe when doubt surrounds. Artists, meanwhile, continue to shape her image anew. In paintings, she appears as a radiant maiden in armour, eyes lifted toward heaven. In literature, she speaks with fire and gentleness, often portrayed as both fragile and unbreakable. In theatre and cinema, she's reimagined again and again, her life retold for new audiences who find in her story something both ancient and immediate. Each retelling is slightly different, yet each returns to the heart of her mystery. Beyond the arts, Joan's influence spills into the realm of identity and belief. Feminist movements celebrate her as a woman who shattered expectations of her age, proving that strength and leadership are not confined to men. Nationalists honour her as the defender of her homeland, a symbol of unity in the face of division. Spiritual seekers admire her as a soul who remains steadfast even in fire. Few figures in history command such wide and diverse admiration. Pilgrimages to her sites continue steadily. In Domremy, visitors walk through the church where she prayed, lingering in the silence of the nave. In Orléans, crowds gather for the annual festival that seems to weave past and present into one thread of remembrance. In Rouen, candles burn in the church raised on the ground where she was executed, a quiet defiance of the flames that once consumed her. The fact that so many travel to these places centuries later testifies to her lasting presence. Joan is more than a figure of history. She's a companion for those seeking courage. To students unsure of their path, To leaders facing difficult choices, to believers seeking strength, she remains relevant. Her words at her trial, "I am not afraid. I was born to do this," still ring true for anyone who feels the weight of purpose. And perhaps this is why Joan endures. She does not belong to the 15th century alone, nor even to France alone. She belongs to anyone who has ever faced fear with conviction, anyone who has felt called to stand firm against overwhelming odds. In this, she is timeless. Her story a flame passed from one generation to the next, never dimmed, never extinguished. In our age of rapid change, Joan of Arc's presence continues to feel strangely near. Though centuries separate her life from the present, her story carries themes that never lose relevance. Courage in the face of fear, conviction against doubt, and faith that outlasts death. Modern societies filled with uncertainty look to her as a reminder that even a single voice, humble, untrained and unexpected, can make a difference. This is why Joan appears not only in churches and textbooks, but also in literature, film, theatre, and even popular culture. Directors cast her life onto the screen, each film reshaping her image, sometimes as a mystic touched by God, sometimes as a military genius, and sometimes as a vulnerable young girl overwhelmed by the burden she carried. Playwrights continue to bring her to the stage, filling theatres with her voice as she argues with judges, rallies soldiers, or prays in the quiet of her cell. Each performance keeps her story alive, retold in the language of the present but echoing truths of the past. Writers have long been fascinated by her trial, that extraordinary moment when a teenage peasant girl faced some of the most educated men of her time and did not falter. Her answers, recorded carefully, reveal a mind clear and steady. "If I am not in God's grace, may He put me there. If I am, may He keep me there," she said. A reply so profound that even her enemies admitted its brilliance. Such words still inspire books, essays, and meditations, for they embody both humility and strength. In the arts, Joan's image is endlessly versatile. She's painted as a warrior in shining armour, a saint bathed in light, or a humble shepherdess listening to the voices of heaven. Musicians compose pieces that echo her journey, some grand and triumphant, others quiet and sorrowful. Sculptors carve her likeness for cathedrals and city squares, making her presence a part of the daily lives of passers-by. Beyond art, Joan's influence is visible in movements for justice and equality. She's cited as a pioneer for women, an example of someone who defied the restrictions of her time to lead men into battle and to speak truth before power. Her story reminds the world that leadership is not bound by gender or status. She speaks too to the young, proving that age is no barrier to greatness. At 17, she carried a banner. At 19, she faced death. Her brief life became larger than centuries. Pilgrims still walk the routes of her journey, Domremy, Orléans, Reims, Rouen, seeking in those places a connection to the mystery of her calling. Standing where she once stood, many feel a quiet strength, as if her spirit lingers not in relics or ashes, but in the faith of those who remember her. And perhaps this is the deepest reason for her endurance. Joan of Arc is not only history remembered, but hope renewed. As the 21st century deepens, Joan of Arc continues to stand as a bridge between past and present, between history and myth. Her name is invoked in classrooms, churches, political speeches, and cultural debates, always carrying with it an echo of courage. She's become more than a French heroine. She's a global figure whose life speaks to the human spirit itself. Technology has only widened her reach. Digital archives preserve every page of her trial, allowing readers around the world to hear her voice as though she still sat before her judges. Documentaries and podcasts retell her story, weaving history with reflection. Even in social media, her words appear, quoted in moments of inspiration. "I am not afraid. I was born to do this." For young people, growing up in a time of change and uncertainty, Joan represents the possibility of transformation. that even the most ordinary life can hold extraordinary purpose. In the arts, her story never sleeps. Directors reinterpret her battles, poets linger on her martyrdom, and composers set her voice to music that rises like prayer. Some see her as a warrior saint, others as a visionary mystic, and others still as a symbol of resistance against oppression. Each portrayal adds a new layer to her legacy, making her less a figure of one time and more a companion for all time. France, of course, continues to honour her deeply. Orléans celebrates her each year with processions and festivals. Domremy welcomes pilgrims who walk the same fields she once tended. Rouen, once the place of her suffering, has transformed into a space of reverence, where silence honours what injustice once tried to erase. Her presence in these places is tangible, as though her spirit lingers in the air, in bells, in footsteps, and in whispered prayers. Yet Joan's influence stretches beyond borders. In the United States she is admired as a figure of independence and courage. In Latin America she's invoked as a saint of justice. In Asia and Africa her story is taught as part of world history, reminding students that greatness can rise from humility. She's become a citizen of the world, a universal symbol whose meaning adapts to every culture that receives her. What remains constant is her message. Conviction matters, and faith can endure even when tested by fire. 5 centuries after her death, she still invites reflection. Was she a mystic chosen by God? A patriot driven by love of country? A visionary whose imagination gave her strength? The answers vary, but the power of her story lies not in explanation but in inspiration. Joan shows us that history is not only written by kings and generals, but sometimes by a girl who listened to a voice and refused to turn away. Joan of Arc's story, reaching across 6 centuries, is not merely the tale of a peasant girl turned soldier, nor simply the record of battles fought and lost or won. It is the enduring echo of a life lived with conviction so pure that it transcended her time and became timeless. From Domrémy's quiet fields to the walls of Orléans, from the Cathedral of Reims to the stake at Rouen, her path was short in years but vast in meaning. She lived only 19 years, yet those years carried a weight that continues to inspire the world. The power of Joan's legacy rests in contrasts. She was at once humble and extraordinary, young yet filled with wisdom, fragile in body yet unbreakable in spirit. Her voices, whether one interprets them as divine or psychological, gave her a clarity of purpose that few ever achieve. She did not seek power for herself, wealth, or recognition. Her only aim was obedience to the call she believed came from God. In that obedience, she changed the course of a war and gave her nation a symbol that would outlast empires. The injustice of her trial and the cruelty of her death might have silenced her, but instead they magnified her. Martyrdom turned the girl from Domrémy into the Maid of Orléans, the saint who carried light into darkness. Centuries later, when the Church declared her innocence and later her sainthood, it was only confirming what people had long felt in their hearts, that Joan was touched by something greater than herself. Today she remains present not only in statues and stained glass, but in the hearts of millions who look to her for strength. Soldiers see in her the courage to face battle. Believers see in her the faith to endure trials. Women see in her a figure who broke through the boundaries of her age. The young see in her proof that age does not limit destiny. Her words and actions continue to inspire leaders, artists, and dreamers alike. To walk in Orléans during her festival, to stand in Domrémy's fields, or to pause in Rouen church built on the site of her martyrdom is to feel that her spirit still lingers, not as a ghost of the past, but as a companion in the present. Joan of Arc reminds us that the measure of a life is not its length, but its depth. She lived with conviction, stood firm in faith, and accepted even the flames with words of prayer. And in doing so, she left the world a legacy stronger than armies or crowns. She remains a beacon for all who seek courage in the face of fear, hope in the midst of despair, and light in times of darkness. The girl who became a warrior saint still speaks, not through voices heard in visions, but through the example of her life, calling each generation to stand firm, to believe, and to never be afraid of the path set before them.